A lot of lessons from the past that we can start to incorporate. And for Australia, we're so privileged. We have the oldest living culture in the world here. And they were able to use very, very sophisticated knowledge and understanding of how the systems work, even how human health reacted to those systems of plants and animals and the environment more broadly. And they were able to sustain their communities.
Well, hello again and welcome to another episode of Finding Equilibrium. And today my guest is Dr. Christine Pitt, who feels like you have so many things I could say, but right now your latest venture is as co-founder and CEO of the Food Futures Company, which is an incredibly exciting venture. And I've had the privilege of working with you a little bit. But Christine, thank you very much for finding time in your very busy schedule to spend some time with us today. How's your day going?
It's going great, Lawrence. I'm relaxing on the Hunter Valley as we speak. So
Nice.
I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land where I am today, and acknowledge the ownership and custodianship of the traditional owners there, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Normally Food Futures is on the south coast of New South Wales, though.
Cool. Nice. Well, thank you for interrupting some of your holiday.
Thank you.
Food Futures, and it's very interesting because whenever I have a guest on the show, I look at their history and their career, and when I look at yours, it's almost like you've had 10 careers in one. It's like, so you've done so many things, and it's like, wow, how have you fitted all of this in? But maybe the starting point is just giving the audience an overview of what the Food Futures Company is, and then I'd love to know what your path has been to creating this amazing venture.
Thanks, Lawrence. Well, Food Futures Company, as hopefully the name implies, is really looking at the future of food. And I guess we started the company in 2018 because we felt that the food system, the agri-food system globally, but also here specifically in Australia, needed a bit of transformation and disruption. And I think that's really borne out in the last 12 months during COVID, where we've seen some significant problems in the food system across the supply chain and logistics. But also I think people have started to be more, consumers are more reflective now, and they're looking for food and the food system to deliver, greater impact for them personally on their own health and wellness, but also on the planet and the environment. So that was really, we were perhaps a little bit ahead of our time, I don't know, but Food Futures was really established as what we would call an innovation design, ecosystem design firm to work in the food system around some of the things that we think hopefully will change over the next decade.
Okay, it's interesting. So if you unpick that a little bit, so what you touched in terms of the ecosystem, so does Food Futures look at the entire system? So it will look at the journey, if you like, from field to plate, that entire system.
Yes, there's so many little sayings, isn't there? Farm to fork, soil to spoon. There's all sorts of ways of thinking about it.
And it's quite a complex journey, isn't it? If you really dig into that.
Yeah, so yes, definitely. We definitely take a whole systems approach to any of the work that we do, and a whole of value chain, right from the beginning of the agricultural system through to consumers. So we work right through the value chain and look at all of those areas where either impact or value is positive impact, or value is not being created, and think about how whether it be new technologies or building capabilities or disrupting the value chain design, how those elements of the whole system can be really looked at. But we go broader than that as well. So looking at the research side, institutional, government, etc. So yeah, we really try and work across and take that whole systems approach to whatever we do.
Cool. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But let's go back and understand how you got to running this company or creating this company, because you started your career in a very different way. You weren't in food at all. So what share with us a little bit of your story and what inspired you to become so passionate about the food industry to do what you're doing now.
Well, I think I was probably born and have finally arrived at my place, if that makes sense. I was born into a family where food was really important. So I came from a long line of dairy farmers here in Australia, but also from Europe and the UK. But I think probably my mother instilled a love of food in me, and food was, as I said, a really important part. Even though she's Scottish, and people sort of think of the English and Scottish diet as being sort of fairly dour and boring. She was a real experimenter, and so we always were looking at different kinds of foods and enjoying different foods. So I grew up with a love of food and an understanding of the importance in terms of regional communities, but also in terms of social, family, and health. So Mum was also really into nutrition and alternative medicine, really. So it was quite interesting. So even though I didn't start my career in food, I did start it in science. So my original degrees were in human health. And once again, I think, if you follow my career journey, which has taken me from health through to technology and disruption around the implementation of new technologies and the impact technology has on humans, and then right through, I spent quite a bit of my career in the red meat industry, so definitely in the agri-food sector. And that's where I really started to look at innovation and how Australia needed to position itself globally as far as being a high-value agri-food system, not a commodity food system. And so there were lots of things that prompted me along that journey. But I think it's that merging of health, an understanding of the impact of the agri-food system on environment and community, and then technology. So bringing all those together, I think, Food Futures is probably the kind of the culmination of all of that thinking.
That's cool. So it's almost like you designed that career, but you didn't know exactly where it was going to lead to.
Yes, I'll say it was by design. But,
by design, but it kind of happened.
Yeah, probably more by magic and accident.
No, it's wonderful. So let's talk a little bit more about the food system and what you see in terms of the in terms of the issues. I think a lot of people will be aware of some of the issues, but when you look at the way we're eating or the way we're consuming food now, and that desire or that interest and awareness around health, what do you think needs to change for us to create an abundant future for the planet to survive, or the people on the planet to survive and thrive and have access to what I would refer to as the basics, good quality fresh food, fresh water, and easy access for people around the world?
So it's a really big question, Lawrence, and I don't know if I've got anything specifically unique about how I'm going to answer that question, because there's definitely a real movement now around the world, and in some ways you could say we're almost we're going forward by looking at our past and looking at some of the more traditional cultures and how they've managed their food systems. And as you know, I'm very interested in native ag and food, so I will refer to that in a moment. But even if you go back to the emergence of the slow food movement in Europe, I think we were starting over the last couple of decades to realize, a lot of people were starting to realize that perhaps this sort of fast-paced, commoditized, high volume thinking about the food system was not really where we wanted to end up. And I think, unfortunately, Australia, for a couple of reasons, has tended to follow what was the dominant US model in terms of how we constructed our food system. So very kind of narrow, limited range of crops, introduced livestock species, obviously, but really forgetting about biodiversity. And really, it's almost like, it was to plant and grow those crops at any cost. We didn't really think about or understand what the long-term impact was that was going to be. And I think probably, when I was in the red meat industry particularly, I got the opportunity and privilege to work with a lot of farmers, and farmers themselves were starting to realise that this was not going to serve us well. They do see themselves as carers of the land, and so they were starting to think about, and we started to see the emergence of new farming systems, organic farming, regenerative farming, and so on. But I guess none of that had really reached the mainstream until quite recently. And I think that's where consumers have started to play a big role as well. So the consumer voice, now that social media and, it's so much easier to get your message out there. You don't have to be a big corporate with a big marketing budget to tell people what they should be eating or even discuss what food should be about. Now, consumers and quite small, agile companies have got a voice. And I think that's been a big change as well. So I think these two trends have come together. We've seen the emergence of plant-based alternatives, plant-based diets. I mean, there's a lot of misinformation around as well, and I think consumers do get a bit confused about that. So I think there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of awareness now that we need to go back to some of those more traditional ways of thinking about the food and the food system, about how we grow food, how we consume food. So maybe not every food's going to be available to us in large volumes all of the time. So a deeper understanding of seasonality. I think during COVID, everyone's really, and even before that, the bushfires, which affected where I was living, people developed a much stronger sense of community. And so I think all of these big trends, these big social trends are really coming together to tell us what we need to do. It's not rocket science. No. It doesn't have to be rocket science.
It's funny you say that. It feels like we've made it much more complex than it really should be. When you touch on that history, you realise that we'd focused on efficiency, I guess, and volume, and we'd not looked at the bigger picture. And now, of course, we realise that there's always going to be an impact if you just focus on one different element. So now we've got to, I guess, correct some of the mistakes of the past and create a better system that supports the future, and not just the immediate future, but generations to come.
Exactly. And I think, as I mentioned or touched on briefly, there's a lot of lessons from the past that we can start to incorporate. And for Australia, we're so privileged. We have the oldest living culture in the world here. And they were able to use very, very sophisticated knowledge and understanding of how the systems work, even how human health reacted to those systems of plants and animals and the environment more broadly. And they were able to sustain their communities for millennia with really healthy food, with medicines that worked, and with, in a sense, an agricultural system that was regenerative in the purest sense. And so they really understood how to protect Mother Earth, as it were, as well as looking after themselves and their communities. And unfortunately, I think, we've kind of lost our way a little bit. We've failed to understand and recognise that, really rich understanding that they can bring. And I think there's also an opportunity to, and there's a lot of complexity around that, and we need to not just race forward and think, oh, okay, well, there's all that knowledge, we'll just grab that and fly it and off we go. So it's not going to work like that either. But I think if we can come together with those knowledge owners in our traditional communities here in Australia, our Indigenous First Nations people, but also across the world, really, there's many examples of cultures that understand these things. But then think about how do we bring modern science and modern technology and modern thinking in an appropriate way and join together. So kind of go on this journey together with that sort of ancient knowledge and modern science. And I think if we did it like that, and if we thought more deeply about it and took the whole systems approach, we wouldn't, as you pointed out before, we wouldn't develop this one-dimensional way of thinking about these things. It wouldn't just be a simple linear path.
It's much more complex.
much more complex. But I don't, as I said before, I don't think it's rocket science. So it's not so complex that we can't do it.
No, I mean, it's almost the ultimate, it's collaboration at the ultimate level, isn't it? Because if science and technology get together with ancient wisdom and really collaborate, like recognize what each different group has to bring, then of course we've got a much wider perspective, and then of course we can create that magic, because and a lot of it is around communication, you know, understanding, showing respect, I guess, for different people's knowledge and perspectives. And then we can really start to really change or create more harmony in the world. What was it? I don't know if there was a specific moment, but what was it that inspired you, or that encouraged you to become more familiar with the ancient traditional people of Australia? Like, what did you have connection with the Indigenous groups when you were young, or did it happen later in your life? Like, where did that interest come from?
So no, unfortunately, like most Australians of my generation, and probably you're not Australian born, Lawrence, but you know, we didn't receive any education about our our true history or our long-term history. We seem to think it was a relatively new history that we had to learn about, or we were looking outside of Australia. So no, unfortunately, I didn't learn a lot about Indigenous culture or anything really. I came in contact with Indigenous people because on the south coast of New South Wales, there's quite a large Indigenous community. So, you know, I was fortunate that, you know, unlike people maybe who come from Sydney or possibly even Melbourne, you know, you don't really see or meet or have the opportunity to speak with and learn from Indigenous people. So I had a little bit of contact, but it was probably only when I joined the red meat industry that I really started to think about it a lot. So, you know, there's been a history, both good and bad, in the beef industry between pastoralists and Indigenous people, particularly in the north of Australia, where a lot of Indigenous skills were deployed and assisted, you know, the original settlers of the north to really work out what they were supposed to be doing up there, because it's a very harsh country, obviously, and Indigenous people understood it and white people didn't. And so, yeah, it was really, you know, there's quite a lot of large cattle stations that are run and owned by Indigenous people. So started to sort of get more aware. And then it's a long story, so I won't bore your listeners with it. But yeah, so really sort of took it upon myself and one of my colleagues. We set out to find out more. So we spent quite a bit of time trying to understand how that connection could be made a more positive one. And so that was probably where I really started to think about, but that still wasn't the kind of the traditional native ingredients or plants, if you like. So it was really only probably about 5 to 8 years ago that I thought, this is really interesting. You know, there's something I want to learn about more. So I made some steps to sort of put myself in contact with people. I joined the board of Australian Native Food and Botanicals, which is the peak industry body. I'm still a director there today, and you know, we're so lucky we have 50% of our directors are Indigenous, and our chair is a wonderful Indigenous leader, Suzanne Thompson from Central Queensland. So I've now got a lot of opportunities, if you like, to learn and to immerse myself in the sector. And Food Futures Company in 2020 took our first step to see what we could do to work specifically in this space as well.
That's really cool. And so what types of steps are you taking? Like, what are there initiatives that you're working on at the moment through Futures Company that's really bringing some of that ancient wisdom, that ancient knowledge? Because to me as well, as you said, I wasn't born in Australia, and like most people, most Brits, if you like, your perception of Australia tends not to be a land with thousands of years of history. You have a perception which is very much the modern version. It's only when I was living here for a year or so, I went to Uluru, and that brought me in contact with the Indigenous people. And what they spoke, it was such deep wisdom, made so much sense. You know, sometimes you just hear the way that they live in harmony with the natural world, and you realize where we've made some errors of judgment, if you like. And it feels very, very straightforward. But I guess the challenge we have is how do we shift? How do we change? How do we start to learn and start to create more harmony in our environment? So I'd love to hear what steps you've been taking at Food Futures Company.
So as I said, we try and take whole systems approach. So we did quite a bit of research just to start off with, and start to try and understand, where the industry was at. It's interesting because it's still described as an emerging industry here in Australia, even though it's the oldest one. And I think that's fair enough too, because it has, for a whole variety of reasons, still been quite fragmented, not well understood. Consumers are pretty cluey now, though, about the importance of native ingredients, and there's huge demand both in Australia and internationally. But the industry itself, the whole kind of value chain and system behind it, has probably only in fairly recent years started to mobilise and think about how it could develop as a fully integrated, commercially viable global sector sort of thing. So we're really only at that starting point. So we did, as I said, quite a bit of research to try and understand. At the beginning of 2020, we developed a database of well over 100 businesses or people in the sector. And so we did lots of interviews with people, talking to people, working out where the gaps were, what we could do to help. I didn't mention before, but one of the key focus areas of Food Futures is the startup world, so new ventures. We see that as being a critical way in which all of the agri-food system can move forward probably quicker than it would otherwise if we just relied on traditional current businesses. There needs to be good collaboration between startups and big corporates, but startups need to be nurtured. And that's core to one of the key things that we do across all of the agri-food sector. But so I guess what we were imagining and what we started with was there must be entrepreneurs out there, there must be Indigenous people out there who, with some support and some of the skills that we could bring. We're not experts in the native ag and food sector, but we know quite a bit about creation of new ventures, implementation and introduction of new technologies, building markets and so on. So we thought, well, if we could bring our expertise to existing entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs, we might be able to make a difference. So that's what we did last year. We launched the first and still only accelerator program in the native ag and food sector. We were very, very keen to make sure that there was strong representation of Indigenous-led businesses, and we got some really great applications. So we got between, I think it was about 60 to 80 applications for 12 positions that we had available. We had some very, very good and knowledgeable Indigenous mentors who were able to both guide us, help us select the businesses, interview and select businesses into the program, but also mentor the participants once the program started. And so, yes, so we had 50% Indigenous-led, 50% non-Indigenous-led, but all of the non-Indigenous-led businesses were grilled, if I can put it that way to start with, to make sure that they understood the whole concept of benefit sharing and respect of Indigenous knowledge. And they had to be able to demonstrate to us that that was something they were either already doing or building into the way they designed their value chain. So that was a great success. We had lots of publicity last year. We had some great businesses go through, and we're now continuing to work with some of those as a sort of a post-accelerator program. It was interesting, though, one of the things that became really obvious to us was that whilst we had no shortage of really strong Indigenous-led businesses apply and we were able to bring them into the program, virtually none of them were being led by Indigenous women. And Suzanne Thompson, my chair at ANFAB, speaks very strongly about, from a cultural point of view, that this is women's business. And so even though we're all very inclusive, both Indigenous, non-Indigenous, male, female, there just did seem to be a big issue with Indigenous women for many reasons, being disenfranchised, I suppose is the word. And we know from this, as you would know globally, that if Indigenous women can be given that sort of, or can take on that kind of economic role, then whole communities will do better. It's not just an individual thing. So this year we've been building a new initiative, which is about increasing participation of Indigenous women in the native ag and food sector. And that's something that we've got some great partners across the education university system. And we will be hopefully launching that program and announcing that in the near future.
Wow, that's amazing. So the accelerator program, how long does that last? Or the one that you did last year, how long did that last? A few months or longer?
Yes, no, we ran a fairly traditional sort of 12 to 14 week program. So that's where it's very intense and concentrated, and there's things happening every week. It's very challenging in COVID to do all this virtually.
Of course, yeah.
And so, as you know, so normally we would have a combination of both virtual and remote, but this time it was all remote. But yeah, it was a really good group of people. And so, yeah, we had masterclasses, individual coaching, sessions with mentors, lots of design thinking and the sort of the lean startup methodology. So these were businesses that were at various stages, but they all progressed through, looking at how they could, they all had their own specific thing that they needed to focus on. So it was both customized to their business. But we're now sort of opening up to what we might call more of an incubator model, where businesses can come in and it's a very bespoke service.
Okay.
There's no no sort of defined time limit on that.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. So business that needs some guidance or needs some support, then they could come into your incubator system. Yeah. Okay, that's cool. And
yes. So our incubator is not limited to native ag and food, but we have got a very specific interest in there, and we work with outside partners. If companies are looking to raise capital or seek investment of some sort, or they need help putting in a grant application, it might be that sort of help, right through to really, if they're looking at building out their business. We've got a great Indigenous-led business in South Australia called Pundi Produce that we work with. Dom Smith, who's the founder there, he's got very high profile now, but he started off mainly as a grower, and he's now building out into that value adding, and also working to look at how he can extend his knowledge to other Aboriginal owned businesses. As well. Yeah. And then, we, as I said, we also work with non-Indigenous businesses in the native ag and food space. And so there's some really exciting new opportunities for, all sorts of things.
I can't wait. It sounds so super exciting. I mean, we've had this conversation before, but, we're talking, this is a wellness program, and you realize that the deep knowledge and the deep connection with that ancient wisdom and that ancient knowledge really is wellness at the deepest level. If you're, for people who are listening to this, who aren't a startup, if you like, because there's lots of opportunities to engage with you on that level, but just an individual, somebody who's living here in Australia, and this conversation is inspiring them to think, well, what can I do? What's a starting point? Like, where do you begin? Like, how can you start to connect more with that ancient knowledge if you're not living amongst Indigenous people, and you're shopping in Woolworths, and you feel quite disconnected from some of the things that we've been discussing? Where could someone start to begin their own personal journey?
So I definitely would suggest people read a little bit, even if they're not strong readers. So, and there's some really great, very accessible books that you can look at. So one of them, which is quite, it's not a very thick book. It's Dark Emu by Uncle Bruce Pascoe. So I would definitely recommend people, if they get a chance, to have a look at that. Bruce has also authored a new book called Loving Country, which is really interesting because it takes different areas of Australia and really dives into the history, and gives you an opportunity, if you're traveling to that area, to think a little bit more about the culture there. I mean, I think the fact that we can't travel overseas, Australians are moving around a lot more. And so there's a high probability, even if you live in a city where it might not appear at first instance to be so accessible to connect with Indigenous people. There's a great book called Welcome to Country, and also a website where it'll pretty much tell you wherever you are, where you can connect with local Indigenous people and share an experience. So I definitely think that before you just rush out and buy stuff, which is also a good thing, I think, I think it's well worth putting a little bit of effort into making that connection and finding, even in Sydney, like there's some great, there's a group called Indigenous Grow out at La Perouse, where you can go and see the garden. I mean, some of these you have to check because with COVID they're maybe not accessible at the moment. But yeah, even in the city, there's places to go and talk to people and learn about the plants. I would definitely look at purchasing native ingredients, and maybe even thinking about how you might grow native plants, edible native plants. I mean, I think Australians have been growing natives in their gardens ever since I was born anyway. But we didn't realise we could eat half of them. And then the cautionary note is the other half we mustn't eat, because there are some quite poisonous.
So don't just go growing and eating.
So you do need to get a bit educated. So there are lots of businesses. There's a number of businesses that you can. I won't do any sort of promotion here, but if you just Google where do I buy native edible plants, I'm sure you'll find either a local nursery or even I know there are businesses that you can purchase edible plants online, and they'll come with education materials. So I think it's a bit of a holistic approach, sort of start to really understand that connection, I think, between the plants and agriculture and Indigenous people. So inform yourself, I suppose. And then when you're making your purchase, like all consumers are becoming more aware now, make an informed purchase if you can. Don't just go and say, I'm going to buy that shortbread because it's got lemon myrtle in it, or whatever it might be, or that tea. Really dig a little bit deeper into the products that you're purchasing. Where possible, buy from an Indigenous-led business. But even if you're not buying from an Indigenous-led business, have a look at the website and see what they're talking about when it comes to respect for Indigenous people, and make some inquiries. So if we as Australians really support this industry and support Indigenous connection to it, I think it will grow, appropriately, ethically, and quickly, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. I think you touch on that point that with any growth industry, it attracts, let's say, less authentic players. So we as consumers need to make sure we do our homework and are not. It's very similar in the environmental space and anything like that. That often things are just window dressing, and there isn't that deep purpose behind the organisation. So thank you.
Yeah. I think that's, so my response to your question was more at the everyday level, the consumer and all of us as individuals. I think if you come with certain expertise that you would like to offer to the industry, I think there's also lots of opportunities there as well. So, we're really welcome the new people who want to come in and understand more about the work that we're doing, or want to be a mentor, or those sorts of things. So if you've got a skill set that you think might be useful, there's certainly lots of opportunities to actually deploy
those skills. So you're talking like traditional business skills. So like if for example you haven't got that expertise in the actual Indigenous agriculture and food, but you've got, similar to what we were saying at the beginning, how to grow businesses, or how to collaborate and bring groups of people together, or to mediate and those types of things. Okay, so there's opportunities for people to get involved and work with you in that way. Great.
Yeah, and obviously this podcast is for your Singularity University Summit, which is going to be a fantastic event, and so I would definitely put that call out to all your Singularity attendees to have a think about, how can I help? What can I do?
Yes.
And, you don't have to come to us, but we're certainly welcome anyone who would like to find out more about those sorts of opportunities. I didn't mention before, we talked a little bit about technology. And so there's quite a number of opportunities now for anyone who's listening who comes from a technology background, where we're definitely looking at that, connecting modern technology to this sector. And so we've actually got a native ag and food tech challenge, which is about to go up online. So if anyone's working in the technology space and thinks that they might be interested to deploy their technology, there are specific opportunities there as well.
So cool, so amazing. Wonderful. Is there anything else? I'm conscious of time and we need to wrap. Is there anything else that you'd like to share, Christine, that I haven't had a chance to ask you?
I think probably just going back to the broader topic about the future of food, I think, I would really encourage everyone, and I know many more people are today, but to think as best you can deeply about the food system, where your food is coming from, what impact is that food having on you and the health of yourself and your family. So make, as an informed and, good choice as you can. And I know, people have budgets and they can't necessarily do everything they might want to do, but really think about your food purchases and the impact that that's having on the whole agri-food system. And, help all of us position Australia as really one of those, countries that are really delivering a food system that's going to be there for the future, that's a sustainable and ethical food system for the future, and we can all play a role in that. I think that's really the message.
Definitely, yeah, and I think that's a wonderful message. Yeah, and I couldn't just to underline that, we often just we buy food because we're hungry and it's the last thing, and we're not thinking about the true impact of those decisions. So we as consumers have a huge amount of power and a huge amount of opportunity to create change with something which is so fundamental to life. Food is, it's not just something that solves hunger. Food is the life force, isn't it? So, thank you, Christine, for spending time with us. And I just really want to take the opportunity to acknowledge you for everything you've done, not only building the Food Futures company and everything you're doing, and I can see how this is really going to have such a massive impact. But your journey and what you've done until this point, it's very inspiring speaking to you. And I feel I've got lots of other questions I would love to ask you, but we'll have to save those for a part 2. So on that note, thank you so much for spending time with us. Where can people find you?
They can certainly find us at foodfutures.com.au. And yeah, we'd love to hear from you, or you can look me up on LinkedIn, and happy to connect there as well. So thanks, Lawrence. It's been really great talking to you, and I really enjoyed our conversation.
Me too. Thanks so much. And thank you, everyone. And we'll see you next time. Bye now.